Pesticide residue levels on fruits and vegetables vary significantly across regions, and these differences are shaped less by geography alone and more by regulatory frameworks, enforcement capacity, agricultural practices, and trade dynamics. Comparing imported and locally grown produce reveals a complex picture that challenges simple assumptions about what is safer, while highlighting structural inequalities in how food safety is managed across countries. In countries with strong regulatory systems, such as the United States, members of the European Union, Japan, and a few others, pesticide use is governed by detailed approval processes, maximum residue limits, and routine monitoring programs. Produce sold in these markets, whether grown domestically or imported, is often subject to random testing at ports of entry or retail points. As a result, residue levels in these regions tend to fall within legally defined safety thresholds. However, even within these systems, differences emerge. The European Union, for example, generally enforces stricter residue limits and bans a larger number of active pesticide ingredients than the United States, leading to measurable differences in the types and quantities of residues detected on produce. Imported produce introduces additional layers of complexity. Fruits and vegetables grown in countries with less stringent regulations or weaker enforcement may be treated with pesticides that are restricted or banned in importing nations. While exporters aiming at high-income markets often adapt their practices to meet destination standards, compliance is not always consistent. Testing programs regularly detect higher rates of residue violations in imported produce compared with domestic products, particularly for items sourced from regions where regulatory oversight is fragmented, underfunded, or poorly enforced. These violations do not necessarily imply widespread danger, but they do indicate uneven risk distribution and gaps in global food safety governance. Locally grown produce is often assumed to be safer because of shorter supply chains and perceived transparency, but this assumption does not always hold. Local farmers may use similar pesticides as large-scale commercial producers, especially if they operate within the same national regulatory framework. In some cases, smaller farms have fewer resources for training, protective equipment, or compliance monitoring, which can result in misuse or overapplication of pesticides. Conversely, large export-oriented farms may adhere more strictly to residue limits due to economic pressure and frequent inspections. This undermines the simplistic belief that local automatically means lower residue levels. Regional climate also plays a critical role in pesticide use intensity. Tropical and subtropical regions face higher pest pressure year-round, often necessitating more frequent pesticide applications to maintain crop yields. This can increase the likelihood of detectable residues, especially when harvesting occurs shortly after treatment. In contrast, temperate regions with distinct growing seasons may rely less heavily on chemical pest control. As global trade increasingly relies on produce grown in warmer regions to meet year-round demand, consumers in importing countries are indirectly exposed to agricultural practices shaped by very different ecological constraints. Regulatory compliance varies widely across low- and middle-income countries, where monitoring infrastructure may be limited. In these regions, pesticide misuse, including the use of unapproved chemicals or failure to respect pre-harvest intervals, is a documented problem. Produce consumed domestically in such countries often faces far less testing than produce destined for export, meaning local populations may bear a disproportionate exposure burden. This creates a global inequity in which stricter standards protect consumers in wealthier nations, while weaker oversight leaves others more vulnerable to long-term health risks. Another important dimension is how residue standards themselves differ across countries. Maximum residue limits are not purely scientific values, they also reflect political, economic, and trade considerations. A pesticide considered acceptable in one country may be restricted or banned in another, not necessarily because of new evidence, but because of different interpretations of precaution, public pressure, or industry influence. As a result, Imported produce can technically comply with exporting country regulations while exceeding the limits of the importing country, leading to trade disputes and consumer mistrust. Taken together, regional differences in pesticide residue levels reveal a food system that is unevenly regulated and unevenly protective. Imported produce is not inherently more dangerous, and locally grown food is not automatically safer, but the variability in oversight, enforcement, and ecological conditions creates real differences in exposure risk. For consumers, this means that safety depends less on origin labels and more on broader systemic factors that are often invisible at the point of purchase. The broader warning is that global food safety increasingly relies on trust across borders rather than uniform protection. Without greater international coordination, transparency, and investment in monitoring systems, regional disparities in pesticide exposure are likely to persist. These differences may not manifest as immediate illness, but over time they contribute to unequal health risks tied not to individual choices, but to where food is grown, how it is regulated, and who bears the hidden costs of agricultural productivity in a globalized market.